I've been carrying this secret for 21 years. Every morning, when I wake up in my small apartment in São Paulo, I smell the familiar scent of pão de açúcar from the bakery downstairs, and I remember the last time I smelled bread. It was through the rusted bars of a concrete tomb they called rehabilitation. But this isn't just another prison story. This is about the choice that destroyed everything I loved, and the woman who never stopped believing I could come home. My name is Carlos, and in 2003, they told me I'd rot in solitary confinement. They said I'd die forgotten, another statistic in Brazil's overcrowded prison system. They were wrong. But before I tell you why, you need to understand how a 17-year-old kid from Capão Redondo became prisoner 478-821. The favela where I grew up smelled like diesel fumes mixed with feijoada on Sundays. My mother, Odile, worked 3 jobs just to keep our 2-room shack from falling apart. The walls were thin, made of corrugated metal that turned our home into an oven during São Paulo's scorching summers. She'd leave at 4 a.m. to clean office buildings in Vila Olímpia, come home at noon to cook lunch for construction workers, then spend her evenings sewing buttons onto shirts for a textile factory. Her hands were always cracked and bleeding, but she never complained. Not once. I was 17 when I first held a gun. The weight of it surprised me. Heavier than I expected, cold against my palm like holding death itself. I didn't want power or respect. I just wanted my mother to stop bleeding from exhaustion. But wanting to help and knowing how to help are different things. And desperation, meu amigo, it makes you blind to the difference between salvation and destruction. The crack epidemic hit our neighborhood like a tsunami in the late 90s. I watched grown men, fathers, brothers, sons, turn into walking skeletons begging for their next hit outside Igreja São Miguel, the little church where my mother prayed every morning before work. My older brother Marcos was one of them, 22 years old, built like a soccer player, with dreams of working in construction and maybe saving enough to buy our mother a real house. But crack cocaine doesn't care about your dreams. It started innocent enough. Marcos said he was just holding packages for a friend, making a little extra money while looking for steady work. Just temporary, mano, he'd tell me, using that voice people use when they're lying to themselves. Just until I can get something better. But temporary became permanent when he started using the product he was supposed to sell. And when you owe money to dealers connected to Brazil's most powerful prison faction, temporary becomes deadly very quickly. The men who controlled our neighborhood weren't just street thugs. They were part of a criminal organization that ran operations from inside prison cells, coordinating drug sales, weapon trafficking, and territorial disputes across São Paulo state. Cross them, and you didn't just disappear, your entire family disappeared. One Tuesday morning in March, I found Marcos beaten so badly that his own mother didn't recognize him. His face looked like raw hamburger meat, blood mixing with the red dirt of our unpaved street. The smell of iron and fear hung in the air like smoke from a burning tire. He was conscious, barely, whispering the same words over and over. "They're coming for you next, Carlos. They're coming for you next." His left eye was swollen shut, but his right eye stared at me with the kind of terror that changes your DNA. That's when they appeared. 3 men in clean clothes, too clean for our neighborhood. The leader, a guy with gold teeth and tattoos covering his neck, smiled like we were old friends. "Your brother owes us 18,000 reais," he said calmly. "That debt doesn't die just because he's dying." "But we're reasonable people," Gold Teeth continued, still smiling. "Your brother's debt dies with you working for us, or it dies with him, permanently." The choice seemed obvious then. Marcos was my only brother, the person who taught me how to ride a bike, how to talk to girls, how to be a man in a world that didn't give young men many chances to learn. Working for them meant becoming invisible. I'd carry small packages across The city, from Cidade Tiradentes to Vila Madalena, mixing with the crowds at busy metro stations like Sé and República, where millions of people moved like rivers of humanity every single day. São Paulo has over 12 million people. It's easy to disappear in a sea of faces, especially when you're just another moleque, street kid trying to survive. The city's heartbeat became my cover. The constant hum of traffic, the vendors shouting, "Agua gelada, agua gelada," as the smell of grilled corn and churros from street carts, mixing with exhaust fumes and human sweat. My first delivery was to a middle-class apartment in Muca. Clean streets, security guards, children playing in actual playgrounds instead of abandoned lots. I handed a small envelope to a man in a business suit who looked like he'd never missed a meal in his life. He didn't even look at me, just took the envelope, handed me 500 reais and closed the door. More money than my mother made in 2 weeks of bleeding hands and aching back. But invisibility came with a price. Every package I carried contained someone's destruction. Crack cocaine mostly, but also weapons and messages between gang members in different prisons across São Paulo state. I was a cog in a machine that turned human beings into profit margins. I told myself I was saving Marcos, that this temporary sacrifice would free us both from the cycle that was eating our neighborhood alive. But addiction doesn't trade freedom for loyalty. 3 months after I started working, I found my brother dead in a public bathroom in Liberdade, needle still hanging from his arm. Overdose. The very product I'd been carrying killed the person I was trying to save. The irony tasted bitter, like the black coffee my mother drank when she couldn't afford sugar. My handler, a guy we called Phantasma because he appeared and disappeared like smoke, told me Marcos's death changed nothing. "You're in this until we say you're out," he said, his voice calm and matter-of-fact, like he was discussing the weather or ordering lunch. "But I only did this to help my brother," I protested, still holding the hospital paperwork that declared Marcos legally dead. "He's gone now. The debt should be gone too." Phantasma laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the sound a snake might make if snakes could laugh. "Debt? Molek, you think this was about debt? This is about business, and you're good for business." For 6 months, I lived in a gray area between right and wrong, carrying packages and messages across São Paulo's maze of streets and favelas. I kept telling myself I'd find a way out, maybe save enough money to take my mother away from the violence that was consuming our neighborhood. But the streets have their own mathematics. Every favor owed creates 2 new debts. Every package delivered meant deeper involvement. I wasn't climbing out of a hole. I was digging it deeper with every choice I made. The police in our area knew exactly what was happening. Some were paid to look the other way, their monthly salaries doubled by envelopes full of drug money. Others were genuinely trying to help, but the corruption went so deep that good cops became isolated islands in an ocean of bribes and threats. Remember Officer Silva, one of the good ones. He'd patrol our neighborhood on foot instead of staying safe in his car, actually talking to people instead of just watching them like they were animals in a zoo. He knew my mother from church, knew she was working herself to death to keep food on our table. One afternoon, he cornered me near the bus station, where I usually met Phantasma. "Carlos, I know what you're doing, and I know why. Your mother tells everyone how proud she is that you're working, how you're helping with bills." His eyes were sad, like he was delivering news of another death. But this path only leads to 2 places: prison or cemetery. His words hit me like cold rain during São Paulo's winter months, but fear had already rewired my brain. I couldn't see past the next package, the next payment, the next threat from people who treated human life like a commodity to be bought and sold. Silva was right, of course, but sometimes being right isn't enough to save someone from themselves. December 15th, 2002. I remember the date because it was my mother's birthday. She was turning 43, and I'd promised to buy her a new dress with my delivery job money. Something pretty and blue, her favorite color, from one of those stores in shopping El Dorado where she'd never been able to afford anything before. Instead, I was sitting in the back of an unmarked police car, hands cuffed behind my back, watching our neighborhood shrink through the rear window as they drove me toward a future I couldn't imagine. The operation was massive. Dozens of arrests coordinated across multiple favelas simultaneously. Helicopters circled overhead like mechanical vultures, while tactical units kicked down doors and dragged people from their homes. The sound of sirens mixed with children crying and mothers screaming created a symphony of chaos that would haunt my dreams for years. Someone had talked. Someone always talks eventually. The network I thought was untouchable crumbled in less than 6 hours. Names, locations, routes, bank account numbers, everything exposed like a wound being cleaned with alcohol. They found me at Mercado Municipal, the famous market in downtown Sao Paulo, where vendors sell everything from exotic fruits to live chickens. I was supposed to pick up what I thought was just another package from a fish seller near the back entrance. Turned out to be 3 kilos of pure cocaine hidden inside a cooler of ice and fresh tilapia, along with a handwritten list of addresses that connected me to murders I never knew had happened. The fish seller, a grandmother who'd been working that stall for 30 years, started crying when they arrested her too. The detective who interrogated me spoke softly, almost kindly, like a father talking to a son who'd disappointed him. "You're not the target here, Carlos. You're what we call a small fish. But small fish can still drown in deep water if they don't know how to swim." He showed me photographs, crime scenes, bodies, families destroyed by the drugs I'd been carrying. "This is what your packages became," he said. "These are the people your work helped kill." My mother's face when they told her, I'll never forget that moment. It wasn't anger or disappointment, it was something worse, the death of hope. Like watching someone you love realize their dreams were just illusions, mirages in a desert of broken promises. The Complexo do Carandiru was gone, demolished after the massacre of '92 when police killed 111 inmates during a riot that exposed the barbaric conditions of Brazilian prisons to the world. But its replacement, where they sent me to await trial, carried the same spirit of desperation wrapped in concrete and razor wire. The transport van that carried me there was a metal box with no windows, just small ventilation holes near the ceiling. 23 prisoners packed together like cattle, the smell of fierce sweat and vomit mixing with diesel fumes as we bounced through São Paulo's pothole-filled streets. My first morning inside, I woke to the sound of keys rattling against metal, bars and voices shouting orders in the kind of Portuguese that strips away all pretense of civilization. The smell hit me before I opened my eyes. Sweat, urine, industrial disinfectant, and something else. Fear, maybe. Fear has a smell in places like that, thick and metallic like blood mixed with rust. The cell I was assigned to was designed for 4 people, but housed 8. We had 2 concrete slabs that served as beds, a hole in the floor for a toilet, and a single light bulb that flickered on and off, according to some schedule known only to the guards. My cellmates ranged from a 19-year-old kid caught selling marijuana to support his pregnant girlfriend, to a 50-year-old man serving life for murdering his wife's lover. But prison has a way of equalizing everyone. Inside those walls, we were all just numbers in ill-fitting uniforms, waiting for a system to decide our fate. Miguel, my bunkmate, had been inside for 3 years awaiting trial for armed robbery. He became my teacher in the unspoken rules that kept 1-200 men from killing each other daily. "Keep your mouth shut and your eyes open," he whispered during my first night. The guards controlled the keys, but Brazil's most powerful prison faction controls everything else. This criminal organization had transformed Brazilian prisons into a parallel state. They collected taxes from inmates and their families, settled disputes according to their own brutal code of justice, and enforced order through fear and violence. Cross them, and you simply disappeared during the night. Simple as that, but they also provided protection for people like me, small-time offenders who'd be eaten alive without their umbrella. The price was loyalty, absolute and unquestioning. I was about to learn that prison loyalty and street loyalty follow completely different rules. Prison has its own ecosystem, as complex and brutal as anything found in nature. By my second week, I understood the unspoken laws that kept hundreds of desperate men from descending into complete chaos. Morning count at 6 a.m. sharp. Guards walking through each cell, counting bodies to make sure nobody had died or escaped during the night. Watery soup and stale bread for breakfast, if you were lucky enough to get to the front of the line before it ran out. Work detail assignments if you had connections or money to bribe the right guard. Kitchen work was best. Access to better food and the possibility of smuggling extra portions back to your cell. Laundry was second choice, cleaner environment and occasional access to contraband hidden in dirty uniforms. Most inmates got nothing. Endless hours staring at grey concrete walls, playing dominoes with pieces carved from soap, or listening to the radio programs that connected us to a world that seemed increasingly imaginary. Evening count at 6 p.m. Lights out at 10. But between those rigid markers, chaos waited around every corner like a hungry animal. Debts from the outside world followed you inside. Old enemies became new problems, and the faction that controlled our block made sure everyone understood who was really in charge. They called him Comandante, not because he was military, but because his word was law within these walls. Maybe 35 years old, covered in tattoos that told his criminal biography like a roadmap of bad choices. A spiderweb on his elbow meaning time served, teardrops under his left eye marking kills. Portuguese phrases across his chest declaring war against the system. His cell was on the top tier of our block, larger than the others obviously, with luxuries that cost more than most inmates' families earned in a year. A small color TV that received 3 channels, a mini fridge stocked with real soda and cold beer, a mattress instead of a concrete slab, even a small mirror, a dangerous luxury in a place where broken glass could become a weapon. During my 3rd week, he summoned me. 2 of his lieutenants escorted me up the metal stairs, past cells where men watched through bars like animals in cages, to the domain of the man who controlled our daily existence. Your brother owed money to our people outside, he said, not looking up from his dominoes game with 3 other inmates who hung on his every word. 18,000 reais plus interest. That debt doesn't die just because he did. His voice was calm, conversational, like we were discussing football scores or the weather. But his eyes were different, cold and calculating, like a businessman evaluating an investment. But we're reasonable people, he continued, finally looking at me directly. Work for us in here, prove your loyalty, and we'll consider his debt is settled. Plus, you get our protection. Without it, he gestured vaguely toward the cell bars where faces watched our conversation with interest. I thought about Officer Silva's warning from what felt like another lifetime. 2 places. Prison or cemetery. Turned out sometimes they were the same place. Working for the faction inside meant becoming their messenger and intelligence gatherer. Prison communication happens through a complex network that would impress military strategists. Whispered conversations during meal lines, hand signals passed between cell blocks, written notes compressed into tiny pellets and hidden in body cavities or food containers. I carried messages between different sections of the prison, memorized names and numbers of contacts on the outside, and helped coordinate visits where information flowed between the faction's internal and external operations. It felt familiar, just like carrying packages through São Paulo's streets, but with higher stakes and no possibility of escape. The job also meant witnessing things I wish I could burn from my memory. Correction sessions in abandoned maintenance. Cells where rule breakers were taught lessons that often left permanent damage. Inmates who violated the faction's code simply vanishing during shift changes. Their bodies never found. Their families told they'd been transferred to other facilities. Justice administered with improvised weapons, sharpened toothbrushes, broken bottles wrapped in cloth handles, pieces of metal torn from bed frames and shaped into crude knives. Violence so casual and efficient it became just another part of daily routine, like brushing your teeth or eating breakfast. But the job also meant protection in a place where protection meant survival. Other inmates knew I was under the faction's wing, which meant I was untouchable without their permission. I got better food, sometimes actual meat instead of mystery stew, cleaner water that didn't taste like rust and chemicals, a mattress instead of sleeping on concrete that left your bones aching every morning. In prison currency, these were riches beyond imagination. But the price was becoming complicit in a system that destroyed human beings for profit, that turned men into monsters and monsters into leaders. My mother visited every other Sunday, taking 3 buses from Capão Redondo, a journey that took 4 hours each way and cost money she couldn't afford to spend. She'd arrive carrying homemade brigadeiros wrapped in aluminum foil, news from our old neighborhood, and a smile that broke something in my chest every single time. The visiting room was a nightmare of surveillance and desperation, families separated from inmates by thick glass panels, communicating through phones that crackled with static and cut out randomly. Children who'd grown inches since their fathers had been arrested, wives who'd found new boyfriends but still came out of loyalty or guilt. My mother never asked about what I did inside the walls, never questioned why I looked healthier than other inmates, why my clothes were cleaner, why I seemed to have protection that others lacked. She'd just smile and tell me about her new job at a different textile factory, about our neighbor's wedding, about normal life continuing in a world I could barely remember existed. "I'm praying for you every day, Filho," she'd always say before the guards announced visiting hours were over. "God has a plan, even when we can't see it, even when it feels like we're walking through darkness." 8 months into my sentence, I witnessed something that shattered whatever was left of my ability to justify the choices I was making. Another inmate, a kid named Rafael from Cidade Tiradentes, maybe 19 years old, had been accused of stealing from the faction's internal drug stash. Rafael looked exactly like my brother had at that age. Thin from chronic malnutrition, scared eyes that darted around constantly looking for threats, probably hungry enough to make the kind of desperate choice that lands you in prison in the first place. Looking at him was like staring into a mirror that reflected my own past and my brother's destroyed future. He'd been inside for 6 weeks, arrested for stealing copper wire from construction sites to sell for scrap metal. The kind of petty crime that desperate people commit when legitimate. Work pays less than survival costs. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong choices, but nothing that deserved what was about to happen. The Comandante called for what they termed tribunal, their version of justice that had nothing to do with courts, lawyers, or appeals. Just a circle of men deciding another man's fate based on whispered accusations and circumstantial evidence that wouldn't hold up in any legitimate legal system. The accusation was serious. Someone had been stealing small amounts of crack cocaine from the faction's internal supply, drugs that were supposed to be sold to other inmates or traded for favors with guards. In prison economics, this wasn't just theft. It was treason against the only authority that mattered. Raphael swore he was innocent, his voice cracking with terror as he begged the Comandante to believe him. "I don't even use drugs, Kara. I'm trying to stay clean for my mother, for my little sister. Please, I swear on my mother's life, I never touched anything. But innocence doesn't matter when guilt has already been decided." The faction needed an example, a reminder to everyone else about the consequences of betrayal. And Raphael, friendless, unprotected, expendable, made a perfect victim. I was ordered to watch as part of my education in faction loyalty. "You need to understand what happens to people who cross us," one of the lieutenants explained, like he was teaching me mathematics or history. "This is how order is maintained. But education and torture aren't the same thing, even when the lesson is crystal clear." What they did to Raphael, I won't describe the details. Some memories should stay buried, but the sounds he made, calling for his mother, begging for mercy that would never come, echoing through concrete walls that had heard too many similar pleas. That night, I couldn't sleep. Not because of the noise. Prisons are never quiet, always filled with conversations, arguments, radios playing, guards walking their rounds. But because I kept seeing Raphael's face, hearing his voice calling for the same person I whispered to every night in my own prayers. Mine. Something fundamental shifted inside me that night. I realized I wasn't just a prisoner anymore, wasn't just a victim of circumstances beyond my control. I'd become part of the machine that created victims, part of the system that turned human beings into profit margins and examples. Breaking away from the faction wasn't just dangerous, it was supposedly impossible. Their reach extended far beyond prison walls, into favelas, police stations, legitimate businesses, and even government offices across Brazil. Former members who tried to leave ended up dead, along with their families, as lessons to anyone else. Considering betrayal, but impossible and suicidal aren't always the same thing. Sometimes they just feel that way until you're desperate enough to find the difference between courage and stupidity. I started small, observing instead of just existing. During work detail in the prison kitchen, I noticed which guards looked tired of the corruption they witnessed daily, who avoided eye contact because they were ashamed of what they'd become, and who avoided eye contact because they were planning something that might get them killed. Most guards had been absorbed into the system, taking bribes to deliver messages, smuggle contraband, or simply look the other way when violence erupted. But a few seemed different, like they remembered why they'd taken jobs in corrections before the reality of Brazilian prisons crushed their idealism. Guard Benedito was one of them. He'd worked in the system for 15 years, long enough to understand the patterns, but not so long that he'd given up hope for change. He had a daughter my age. I'd seen her photo in his wallet when he was paying for coffee in the guards' break room. Sometimes I caught him looking at inmates like we were somebody's children, not just criminals who deserved whatever happened to us. He treated people with basic human dignity, using names instead of numbers, saying please and thank you, like we were still human beings capable of courtesy. Small things that meant everything in a place designed to strip away humanity, one indignity at a time. One afternoon, while serving lunch from behind the metal counter that separated kitchen workers from the general population, I slipped him a folded piece of paper. Not faction business. This was personal, dangerous, potentially deadly. 3 words written in careful block letters: I want out. His reaction told me everything I needed to know. No surprise, no immediate dismissal, no sudden fear that someone might be watching our interaction. Just a small nod that said he'd been waiting for someone to ask for help instead of demanding favors or making threats. But asking for help and receiving it are different things. And the faction had rules about betrayal that made death seem merciful. By comparison, Working with Guard Benedito meant providing information about faction operations inside the prison, names of leaders, contraband, smuggling routes, planned violence against other inmates, connections between internal operations and external criminal networks. It felt like betraying people who'd protected me, who'd kept me alive when others would have gladly killed me for sport or boredom. But protection built on violence isn't protection at all. It's just delayed destruction, a temporary reprieve from inevitable consequences. The information I provided led to surprise cell searches that uncovered weapons, drugs, and communication. Devices that shouldn't have existed inside maximum security facilities. Contraband seizures that disrupted carefully planned operations. Transfers of key faction members to other facilities, breaking up established power structures and forcing reorganization. Each action weakened their control over our block, but it also painted a target on my back that grew larger and more visible. Every day, prison paranoia operates on the assumption that someone is always watching, someone is always listening, someone is always ready to trade your life for better treatment or reduced sentences. They suspected someone was talking. Informants are as common as cockroaches in Brazilian prisons. But they had dozens of potential suspects. Inmates with shorter sentences looking to reduce their time, people with family members being threatened on the outside, guards facing financial pressure or criminal charges of their own. The beauty of institutional paranoia is that it spreads suspicion everywhere, making the guilty harder to identify while destroying relationships between people who should be allies. Friends stopped trusting friends. Brothers questioned brothers. The faction's own security measures became weapons turned against themselves. Still, I knew my time was limited. Prison secrets are like smoke. Eventually, they find their way through the smallest cracks and reveal their source. And when they found me, the faction's justice would make Rafael's fate look gentle by comparison. Guard Benedito was working on arrangements for my transfer to solitary confinement, not as punishment, but as protection. It's the only way to keep you alive long enough for your testimony to matter in court, he explained during one of our carefully orchestrated conversations in the kitchen storage room. Federal prosecutors are building a case against the faction's leadership, he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. Your information connects internal prison operations to external criminal networks, money laundering, drug trafficking, murder conspiracies, charges that could put them away for decades. My mother's next visit was scheduled for the following Sunday. I had no idea it would be our last conversation through that scratched glass partition, our last chance to touch hands through the small slot designed to pass documents between inmates and their families. Solitary confinement in Brazilian prisons isn't designed for rehabilitation. It's designed to break human spirits through isolation, sensory deprivation, and psychological pressure that drives strong men insane within weeks. My cell was 6 feet by 8 feet, smaller than most closets in middle-class homes. Concrete walls painted institutional green that had faded to the color of sick flesh. A concrete slab for a bed with no mattress, no pillow, no blanket. A hole in the floor for a toilet that backed up regularly, filling the tiny space with the smell of raw sewage. No windows to show the passage of time between day and night. No clock to measure hours that stretched like elastic bands. No human contact except for the meal slot opening 3 times a day to receive plastic trays of food that tasted like cardboard mixed with disappointment. The faction assumed I'd been punished for some minor infraction, disrespecting a guard, fighting with another inmate, getting caught with contraband. Better that than knowing the truth, which would have meant immediate death orders passed throughout the prison system. Isolation gave me something I hadn't experienced in months. Silence deep enough to think without constantly watching my back, calculating threats, or planning survival strategies. But thinking, when you're trapped in a concrete box with only your own mistakes for company, can be more dangerous than any weapon. I thought about Marcos, about the path of small compromises that led us both to destruction. About my mother's, faced during our visits, trying to stay strong while her world collapsed around her, losing both sons to the streets that raised us. About Raphael and all the other young men who'd been ground up by this machine that turned desperation into profit. Time became elastic, without external markers to measure its passage. Hours felt like days when anxiety made every heartbeat loud. As thunder, days felt like minutes when depression made consciousness feel like a weight too heavy to carry. The guards told me my cooperation had triggered a massive federal investigation spanning multiple states. Operation Clean Sweep, they called it. Coordinated raids, financial audits, wiretaps, and infiltration operations targeting Brazil's most powerful criminal organization. "You're the key witness," Guard Benedito explained during one of his unofficial visits, speaking through the food slot while pretending to deliver my evening meal. "Your information connects the inside operations to the outside network. Money flows, communication systems, leadership hierarchies. Without your testimony, they walk free." But being the key witness also made me the primary target. Even in solitary confinement, isolated from the general population, I wasn't truly safe. The faction's reach extended into every corner of the Brazilian prison system, including guards, administrators, and officials who made decisions about inmate placement and security. Death could come through poisoned food, a suicide staged during the night, or a simple administrative error that placed me back in general population, where problems could be solved quickly and quietly. 18 months in solitary confinement changes your brain chemistry, your perception of reality, your understanding of what human beings need to remain human. I'd started talking to myself just to hear a voice, started seeing faces in the concrete wall patterns, started counting things that didn't exist just to have something to count. That's when Guard Benedito brought news that changed everything. The federal prosecutor wants to cut you a deal. Full cooperation in exchange for early release and witness protection. Freedom. The word sounded foreign after so long in captivity, like a language I'd once known but forgotten how to speak. But freedom also meant leaving São Paulo. Leaving my mother, starting over with a new identity in some distant place where my past couldn't follow. It also meant confronting the families of the faction's victims in court, looking mothers in the eye while describing how their sons died, facing fathers who'd lost everything to drugs I'd helped distribute, carrying the weight of truth when silence would be so much easier for everyone involved. "They'll relocate you somewhere safe," Benedito explained. "New documents, new identity, job placement assistance. But you'll never be able to come back. Your old life dies completely. The decision should have been simple: freedom versus death, future versus no future at all. But simple decisions don't exist when you're choosing between different versions of hell, when every option requires sacrificing something you can't bear to lose." I asked for time to think, but time was running out faster than water through broken pipes. The faction had noticed my extended stay in solitary, and questions were being asked. Dangerous questions, with answers that would lead to deadly conclusions. That's when Guard Benedito told me about the letters. My mother had been writing to me every week for 8 months, but prison officials had been intercepting her correspondence to maintain my cover as a punished inmate rather than a protected witness. He handed me a stack of letters tied with kitchen string, 18 months of love, hope, and unwavering faith, written in my mother's careful handwriting. Her words hit me harder than any punishment cell, any threat, any violence I'd witnessed. The first letter was dated 2 weeks after I'd been placed in solitary. "They won't tell me why you're being punished, Filho, but I know you're fighting." Something terrible in there. Remember, you're still my son, still the boy who used to help me carry groceries up 4 flights of stairs when the elevator was broken, still worthy of love, no matter what you've done or seen. Each letter was a window into a world where someone believed in my redemption, even when I'd stopped believing in myself. News from our old neighborhood, updates about her work, questions about my health and safety that prison regulations prevented me from answering. But the final letter was different, shorter, but more powerful. I had a dream about you last night. Carlos, you were walking out of those prison gates, not running, not hiding, walking, like a man who'd faced his demons and won the fight. I'll be waiting for you when that day comes, no matter how long it takes. Reading my mother's letters broke the last walls I'd built around my heart. Not just the words themselves, but the faith behind them. Faith in my capacity for redemption when I'd given up hope that redemption was even possible for someone like me. She'd never stopped believing I was worth saving, never stopped praying for my return to the man she'd raised me to become, never stopped loving the son who'd disappeared into darkness and seemed lost forever. I called for Guard Benedito and told him my decision. Full cooperation, complete testimony, whatever it took to end the cycle that had destroyed my family and countless others across Brazil. The next 6 months were a blur of depositions, interviews, and preparation sessions, with federal prosecutors building the largest organized crime case in Brazilian history. They moved me to a federal facility with actual witness protection, where I could prepare for trial without fear of assassination. The prosecutors were professional, thorough, but also compassionate in ways I hadn't expected from the justice system. They understood that cooperating witnesses weren't heroes, just broken people trying to make amends for choices that couldn't be undone. Your testimony will help convict dozens of people responsible for thousands of deaths, the lead prosecutor explained, but it will also help us understand how these organizations recruit young people, how they exploit poverty and desperation, maybe prevent other kids from making the same choices you made. The trials took 2 years. I testified in closed sessions, protected by screens and voice modulators, but still facing the men who'd controlled my life inside prison. Some showed no emotion. Others stared at me with hatred that could have melted steel. All of them knew I'd signed their death warrants or life sentences. The faction members I testified against received sentences ranging from 20 years to life without parole. Their external network was dismantled, their financial assets frozen, their territorial control broken up and redistributed to smaller, less organized groups. More importantly, the information I provided led to reforms in prison administration, new oversight procedures, and better protection for inmates who wanted to break free from criminal organizations but didn't know how. The day of my release felt surreal, like waking up from a nightmare that had lasted 5 years. I walked through those gates for the last time, not running, not hiding, but walking, just like my mother had dreamed. She was there, exactly where she'd promised to be, 21 months older, grayer, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of years spent worrying about a son who might never come home, but still standing, still believing, still loving unconditionally. We didn't speak for several minutes. We just held each other while São Paulo hummed around us, cars honking their eternal symphony, vendors calling out prices for fresh fruit and cold drinks, construction workers heading home after long shifts building the city that never stops growing. But everything was different now. The same sounds, the same smells of diesel and fried food and human ambition, but I was hearing them with ears that had been trained by silence. Seeing them with eyes that had learned to find hope in the smallest gestures of kindness. "Vamos para casa, filho," she whispered, her voice breaking slightly on the words. "Let's go home, son." But home wasn't a place anymore. It was this moment, this embrace, this proof that love can survive anything if it's strong enough and patient enough. Home was a different apartment in a different neighborhood, but it smelled the same, like hope mixed with struggle, like love that survives anything. My mother had moved us to Cidade Ademar while I was inside, using money she'd saved by working. Double shifts at the textile factory and eating nothing but rice and beans for months. The federal prosecutors kept their promise. New identification documents with a different surname, relocation assistance to help us start over in a safer part of the city, and job placement through a program that helped former inmates rebuild their lives without revealing their criminal history. But the most important part of starting over was learning to forgive. Especially learning to forgive myself for choices that had destroyed so many lives, including my own. It took years to fully understand what had happened in that prison, to process the trauma of witnessing and participating in violence that no human being should experience. I'd entered as a scared 17-year-old making desperate choices to save his family, and emerged as a man who'd seen the darkest corners of human nature, but somehow chose light anyway. My mother never asked for details about what I'd experienced inside those walls. She could see the changes in my eyes, the way I startled at sudden noises, the nightmares that made me wake up screaming for people who were already dead. But she also saw something else, a hardness that had been tempered into strength, a knowledge of evil that made me appreciate goodness in ways I'd never understood before. The nightmares gradually became less frequent. The hypervigilance slowly relaxed. The guilt began to transform into something more useful. Determination to prevent other young people from making the same choices that had cost me 5 years and nearly cost me my soul. Guard Benedito was promoted to assistant warden at the facility where I'd been held. He still works in the Brazilian prison system, still looking for inmates ready to choose redemption over revenge, rehabilitation over retribution. You weren't. My first, he told me during a chance encounter years later. But you were the one who reminded me why this work matters. The faction leaders I testified against, most are still serving their sentences in federal facilities across Brazil. Some of their appeals are working through the court system, but their network was permanently dismantled. The violence that once controlled our prison block was replaced by educational programs, job training, and counseling services that actually tried to address the root causes of crime instead of just warehousing criminals. Dr. Carmen Silva, a psychologist who worked with former gang members, became my therapist and eventually a close family friend. She helped me understand that trauma doesn't disappear. It becomes part of your story, but it doesn't have to be the ending of your story. What you experienced was terrible, she explained during one of our sessions. But what you did with that experience, choosing to break the cycle, choosing to help others, choosing to transform pain into purpose, that's what defines you now. Today, I work with Instituto Resgate, a non-profit organization that helps families navigate Brazil's criminal justice system. We provide legal assistance to people who can't afford lawyers, emotional support to families dealing with incarcerated relatives, and prevention programs in schools and community centers across São Paulo. I speak at schools regularly, sharing my story with teenagers who are facing the same impossible choices I faced 20 years ago. Not to scare them, but to show them that there are always alternatives to the path that seems easiest when you're desperate and afraid. Prison taught me that we're all capable of both terrible and beautiful things, I tell them. The difference is what we choose when nobody's watching, when the consequences seem distant, when desperation whispers that wrong choices are the only choices available. Some of these kids listen, some don't. But even reaching one person makes the work worthwhile, makes the years of pain and struggle meaningful in ways I couldn't have imagined when I was their age. My mother is 71 now, officially retired, but still volunteering at our local church, still growing vegetables and herbs in the small garden behind our house. Sometimes I catch her watching me work in my home office, and I see the same expression she wore during those prison visits. Love mixed with relief that her prayers were answered, even when the answer took longer than she'd hoped. We never talk about those lost years directly, but sometimes she'll mention a news story about prison reform or a young person who's turned their life around, and her smile tells me she understands what we both survived, what we both learned about the power of unconditional love to sustain hope even in the darkest circumstances. If you've stayed with me through this entire story, you understand why I needed to tell it. Not for sympathy or forgiveness. I've learned that forgiveness has to come from within before it can mean anything from others. But for truth, because somewhere, someone is facing the same impossible choices I faced. The same desperation that makes wrong paths look like the only paths. Prison taught me that rehabilitation is possible, but only when people are ready to do the hard work of changing themselves from the inside out. That redemption isn't something that happens to you. It's something you choose every day, sometimes every hour, sometimes every minute when the old patterns try to reassert themselves. The Brazilian prison system is still broken in fundamental ways. Overcrowding, violence, corruption, lack of educational and job training programs. Problems that require systemic solutions, not just individual transformation. But individual transformation is still possible within that broken system for people who are ready to choose something different. There's always another way, always someone willing to help if you're brave enough to ask and humble enough to accept assistance. Always a path back to light, even from the deepest darkness, even when that path requires walking through fire to reach the other side. My name is Carlos, and I've been free for 19 years, free not just from prison walls, but from the choices that put me there, from the cycle of violence and desperation that consumed my brother and nearly consumed me. That freedom is worth every difficult day it took to earn it, worth every nightmare, every moment of doubt, every time I wanted to give up on the possibility that I could become someone better than the worst things I'd done. And if you're listening to this story because you're fighting your own demons, whether they're addiction, crime, violence, or just the quiet desperation that makes people feel trapped in circumstances beyond their control, remember what my mother taught me through 5 years of unwavering faith. You're still worthy of love no matter what you've done or seen. You're still capable of change no matter how far you've fallen or how impossible the climb back seems. The gate is never locked from the inside. Sometimes you just need someone to show you where the key is hidden. Thank you for listening to my truth. Thank you for believing that redemption is possible, even in the darkest places, even for people who've made terrible choices. And thank you for staying until the end, because ending the story is how we begin to heal. How we transform pain into purpose, how we make sure that suffering serves something larger than itself. Remember, there's always another way, always.